This is Mrs. Palmer-Quay with the fourth video for Unit 7. In this video I want to go over a few developmental aspects of the nervous system and cover 3 common neurological disorders. When it comes to the brain, most of your neurons have developed before you are actually born. But what happens after you are born is that the synapses between the neurons develop. And that's what allows you to make decisions and to remember things, to analyze, do all of this, the higher order thinking that humans are known for. In fact, synapses are not only built, but they are also pruned over time. There are at least 2 major time periods in human development when synapses are pruned back. One is early on in childhood and then later on in adolescence. So that this pruning is going to depend on what a person has experienced, what their environment has challenged their brain to do. The brain basically will get rid of synapses that don't seem to be used. The other major thing that happens with your central nervous system over time is that there's myelination of axons that occur. When a baby is born, there is not much myelination among the axons in the nervous system. This happens mostly between the time of birth and 3 years, but again there is another burst of myelination that happens during adolescence. And in adolescence I'm really talking up into the early 20s, so into young adulthood the brain is still getting itself in shape in the final adult form. So we used to just think about genetics as being the big influence in what the brain is able to do, how it develops, but really now scientists have found that personal experiences and the environmental conditions that someone lives in has a great deal of impact on their own brain formation. So the brain develops from the bottom up. When a baby is born, the brain stem, midbrain and brain stem, is pretty well developed, and that covers sort of the basic life skills, the vital signs, being able to maintain your heart rate and blood pressure and breathing, body temperature. For the most part babies can do that, being awake or asleep, knowing that you're hungry or full. The brain comes already with those skills developed because those are part of the brain stem, and that's considered by scientists to be the more primitive part of the brain. It's certainly not the part of your brain that does a whole lot of thinking. But the development of those thinking skills and making those synaptic connections is what happens over time as the brain develops. And so we eventually get to the point where we can actually handle abstract ideas as teenagers and adults. But before that point, we're developing emotions, understanding emotions, having attachment to other human beings, thinking about the world, making associations. So this development to the higher order of thinking is something that happens over time as our brain is making connections between neurons, developing those pathways that allow us to understand things and talk about them. We know from animal studies that there are certain times that are known as sensitive periods, or you can think of them as being windows of opportunity for the development of certain abilities. Things can be done in animal studies that you would never do to a person, and so we can only postulate that some of these things are also true. But we do know that infants need to attach to a caregiver. This came out of some observation of what happened with orphans that were in crowded conditions and were not handled much by caregivers, and many of them would die. It was known as a failure to thrive condition. We also have learned that languages, learning another language, is best to happen before age 10. Of course, we learn a language without even having to work very hard at it as a child because our bodies have been designed to learn language. And to learn a second language without an accent, you really have to do it before you're 10. The brain can do these things if you miss a sensitive period, like you try to take a language when you're in high school, since that's how our educational system is set up. You can make up for missed time to some extent, but it will be harder, and you'll never have the facility that you would have if your brain was challenged to learn that task at the time that it was really geared up to do it. But this is something that's really an area of new research. We're only getting glimmers at what some of these sensitive time periods are. So these are sort of obvious things, factors that aid in brain development. Good nutrition. This is important not only for the prenatal development, but also then for developing brains during childhood and adolescence, and really to keep yourself healthy all of your life. You need to be concerned about what you're eating. They're also, because your brain is influenced by the emotional support and the relationships that you are in, having an emotionally supportive community around you will allow your brain to develop to its fullest extent. And having a variety of experiences, giving more bits of memory, more places for those neurons to connect, overall will develop the brain to the fullest extent. And then on the flip side, factors that will harm brain development. I know these sound really simple, but it's amazing if you think about some of the things that we do to ourselves that are actually contrary to what we know would be a good idea. So poor nutrition, the opposite of good nutrition, this can actually be a problem, especially when the brain is growing and developing, but certainly to try to stay healthy long term, you need to be concerned. Toxins. I'm sure you have heard of fetal alcohol syndrome. This is something that when a mother is consuming a large amount of alcohol, it will impact on the brain development of the child, make permanent changes, conditions that cannot be reversed. Lead poisoning tends to come after a child has been born, and this used to be a problem because lead was used as part of the pigment, to make the pigment in coloring paint. That's not a problem with current paints, but with older houses and old paint it still can be. And of course, drugs of all kinds, illegal drugs, even the ones that people say, oh, it's not hurting you, it's probably affecting your brain in a detrimental way. You know psychologically that trauma and abuse can have an impact on someone, and it can actually cause changes within the brain. Severe situations, because of the stress on the body, can actually rewire the brain. Now we're going to look at some common disorders, 3 common disorders. The first 2 have to do with neural tube development. And here we're going back to the prenatal state of brain development, where it's developing in the baby before birth. The central nervous system develops from a neural groove in the developing embryo. At this point, we're talking just really a blob of cells. Very early on, within the first month of development, the cells are beginning to differentiate. Those that are going to become the nervous system have clustered in the center of this disk of cells, and the neural groove will eventually fold over to become a neural tube that then will eventually become your brain and spinal cord. But if in this folding over process, if it does not completely close when the 2 sides come together, and I do have a picture on the next slide, some serious birth defects can occur. A key nutrient for preventing neural tube defects is folic acid. Folic acid is found in your leafy green vegetables, things that are known, that contain foliage, contain folic acid. And so folic acid is one of the key prenatal vitamins that is prescribed to a woman once she learns that she is pregnant. However, since the neural tube is formed in the first month of the baby's development, someone may not realize that they are pregnant and may not be taking prenatal vitamins. So that's just a reason to be always eating healthy so that you will have these nutrients in your body. We've known about the connection between a lack of folic acid and a greater chance of neural tube defects for about 25 years. There are maybe other factors involved in neural tube defects, disorders from the neural tube not closing completely. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area. So this series of diagrams is showing the development of the neural tube that will become the spinal cord and brain. So we're moving progressively from left to right in this developmental process. Starting over here on the left, you have you can see there's sort of a flat disc of cells. This is all made up of many, many little cells in there. It's just a piece of tissue. And by the time you get to the other end here on the right, we see where the neural tube has folded together, and this will become the spinal cord forming in here and the brain forming at this end. So if this tube does not close all the way, if things remain open, then the cells that are in that part of the developing embryo are going to be exposed to amniotic fluid, which the embryo is floating in, and that will cause loss and damage to the neural tissue to the point where some parts may not develop at all. So that's the cause of this first disorder, anencephaly. This is caused if the neural tube does not completely close at the top, and so the cerebrum and the cerebellum does not develop. Usually the fetus will die before birth because, as you can imagine, this is a very significant birth defect. But there have been cases where children have lived for a short time after birth. I did find one on the internet who had lived almost 2.5 years. Long-term prognosis, you don't have a cerebrum, you're not going to have the development of a great deal of intelligence and thinking ability. You certainly would have some emotional interaction because that's part of the limbic system, which is found in your midbrain and brainstem. But there's big parts of the brain that are not there, so that the person would always need a lot of supportive care. There may be a genetic connection to some types of anencephaly, but in most cases just seem to be random, completely sporadic. You couldn't predict that it was going to happen. So here's a diagram of what happens that you just do not have this whole part of the brain develop. This was a child over here that I was talking about. She lived to be about 2.5, died eventually of an infection, just didn't have the resources in her body to fight it off. So this is not a photoshopped picture. She was missing this top part of her head. You see it's not here, drawn in the diagram, and then the actual person, there's no brain there, there was no structure. Spina bifida is the most common neural tube defect. The name means a cleft spine, an open spine, and it actually has a whole range of variations. There can be a closed condition where you really don't see anything wrong, and the person may have very, very, very minor symptoms, if anything at all, and then to a situation where it's actually the spinal cord is open to the outside because of the meninges themselves didn't even close off. So here is a picture. We've got a diagram here below that's showing several different types of spina bifida. In this first one, you can see there's just some defects here in the vertebrae, and so does not seem to be a whole lot of effect made on. Maybe some of these spinal nerves did not get all the way out the way they were supposed to. But basically, this is a very mild form of spina bifida on the left. Then in the central, you can see that the meninges have come out of an opening between two vertebrae, but the nerves have stayed pretty much intact. So this one's not going to be a very serious case so far as the symptoms, but if you have a situation like this third, where not only you've got the meninges bulging out, but the spinal nerves have not gone where they are supposed to, the sacral nerves have not gone out between the vertebrae, you are not going to have the nerve development that you would expect for the lower limbs. This situation, this person would be experiencing paralysis, there wouldn't be bladder function, they would be in a wheelchair. We have an example up here of this child who has been diagnosed with spina bifida. You can see that it's going to be one of these two versions. We can't tell for sure if there's nerves have been pinched off in there, but it definitely has this bubble of fluid filled. The meninges has come out from in between the vertebral column, and then the cerebral spinal fluid is creating this bubble on the back of the child. So that's spina bifida, and the amount of problems that the person will experience depends greatly on what level of condition they have, how much the spinal nerves have been affected, whether it is just a tiny dimple on the middle of their back or a situation where they're experiencing paralysis of the lower limbs. And the last disorder I want to talk about is cerebral palsy, which is a general term for a whole bunch of disorders. The cerebral palsy would be anything that would impair the control of movement so that the voluntary muscles are not controlled as well as they should be due to damage of the brain. And again, like spina bifida, you have a whole range of impairment from very mild cases where someone may just limp slightly to a very severe case where they have to be wheelchair bound and may have to use a computer or something to speak. They're not able to communicate without adaptive technology. So anything that will cause damage to the developing brain may end up with a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. This can include infections in the mother, something like rubella, German measles, one of those things that you should get vaccinated for if you can at all possibly. Any kind of birth injuries. A friend of mine, her daughter was injured at birth. The doctor delivered her with one of the, I don't know what it's called, but it's like a suction device to help deliver her a little bit faster, but actually ended up injuring the brain underneath, and she's had cerebral palsy as a result. If the baby suffers a lack of oxygen, either because of something that's happened to the mother before birth or some birth trauma or something immediately after birth, it can result in cerebral palsy. Or a person who has experienced a traumatic brain injury at any age can end up having the symptoms of cerebral palsy because of the permanent damage that it will do to the motor cortex and the conversations that happen between the neurons in the brain and the skeletal system, skeletal muscle system. There are 3 types of cerebral palsy. Spastic is probably the most common, the one where you see there are certain muscles that seem to be contracted and cannot be relaxed. Persons with spastic cerebral palsy typically have poor coordination. They may have difficulty speaking because muscles are too tight and they can't get them to relax. So you've loss of voluntary control is what characterizes cerebral palsy. Dyskinetic, this type, the muscle tone actually fluctuates between being too loose and too tight and may actually result in some sort of involuntary movement that can end up looking a little strange at times, but this is not anything that the person can control. Ataxic is the rarest form of cerebral palsy, and in this case, the voluntary movements are so poorly coordinated, the person may suffer from what's known as intention tremors, which means when they intend to do something, when they go to move their muscle to pick up a cup or to try to zip up their clothes or button a button, then their hand would shake so much that they might not even be able to accomplish that task. Although 35 to 50% of all people with cerebral palsy also experience seizure disorders or have learning disabilities, the other 50 to 65% have perfect normal intelligence and may just be held back behind this barrier of contracted muscles and difficulty speaking, that their intelligence just can't come out. So this is not a disorder where a limited intelligence is necessary. People with abnormal intelligence can be suffering from cerebral palsy. And finally, I just want to briefly talk about the effects of aging on the nervous system. The good news is that the peripheral nerves are not affected. Your peripheral nerves are pretty sturdy, but the central nervous does experience changes with age. Brain cells do die. They decrease primarily in the temporal lobes and then in the frontal lobe over time. Not only do cells die, but the number of synapses, the connections between the dendrites and the axons, also decrease, and the amount of neurotransmitters that are produced goes down with time, so that not only are there less cells to communicate, but the communication medium, the neurotransmitters, are not available in the same amount of number. So as a result, as you can imagine, memory will decrease, and the reflexes and reaction times will slow. But there are things you can do. Physical exercise, I've said this in other tapes, in other videos, but really this is like the universal cure-all, that physical exercise can help decrease the rate of cell loss. As the physical exercises increases the circulation to the brain, it continues to bring nutrients to keep the cells healthy. It will help take away the wastes that may become toxic if they are left there. Also, when it comes to connections between the nerves and the muscle cells, especially as you age, it is really a use it or lose it situation, that things deteriorate if you don't keep on using them, and this includes those reflex arcs, so that if you are continuing to challenge your muscles and asking your posture reflexes to be active because you are moving and standing erect and challenging your muscles to behave in the way that they were meant to, then you continue to keep those nerves and muscles strong. Also, you can continue, even though you lose some of your dendrites, you can build synapses all of your life by doing something that is entirely new to you. Kind of the old prescription was, well, you stay active and you do crossword puzzles and that'll keep your brain active. Well, that's if you're somebody who's done crossword puzzles, just doing crossword puzzles as an older person will not necessarily keep your brain alert. You want to try something new, learn a new language, learn a new instrument, learn how to paint, learn a new recipe, learn something entirely new so that you build new synapses and you challenge your brain to go in a new direction, because that's what's going to keep your brain young. So that covers what I wanted to talk about in this short video. This is the final video for this unit. We'll be talking about the special senses and the sensory structures that are involved in the nervous system in the next unit. But this is the end of the ones that are just specific to the nervous system.